turn it over to Barbara Nouveau, and you're going to kick us off.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Preserving Democracy, Understanding HR1 and S1. My name is Barbara Nouveau. I'm a founder and the executive director of Do the Most Good. We're thrilled by the interest that we've gotten in this session tonight, and that we have people signed up from California, Washington State, throughout the Midwest, and up and down the Eastern Seaboard. For those of you from those far-flung areas and those of you closer to home who don't know Do the Most Good, I'll give you the story in a nutshell. A week after the 2016 election, a group of refugees from the Hillary campaign got together on a rainy night to grieve and to organize a way forward. And the outcome of that meeting was the launch of Do the Most Good on December 3rd of 2016. So through the last 4 years, what we did is we focused on elections and voter registration wherever we could do the most good. Clever name, huh? From early special elections that we got engaged in 2017 and the Virginia statewide elections back in 2017, we moved on to the 2018 midterms, working in critical swing states and spending a little time in our own home state trying to get rid of Governor Hogan, but that didn't work. We moved on then to more wins, and making more wins possible in Virginia in 2019 and playing an important role in the massive effort to turn America blue again in 2020. So it was pretty much all elections for us, but at the same time, we did start to build up our advocacy skills by focusing on the Maryland Legislative Assembly, since Congress was basically in gridlock, and we pretty quickly figured out that it wasn't worth us spending time trying to get the Senate to do anything. And we knew that the House would do the right thing. So if there was any doubt, though, that we would need those advocacy skills at the national level this year, the disappointing down ballot results for Democrats in November, followed by the January 6th insurrection, put that to rest. The flood of voting restriction bills that have been introduced in over 30 state legislatures in the last month, the ongoing false narrative about voter fraud, the Republicans' blind fealty to the deposed leader, all of that makes it very clear that democracy is really on the line. So as our group talked about how we could be effective, we reached out to some of our longtime partner organizations who shared our views, and that got us here tonight. And I want to take just a minute and thank those co-sponsors who are with us tonight. We have Indivisible MoCo, Indivisible Waterfront, MoCo Women, Nope, Silver Spring Progressive Action, Virginia Democracy Forward, and the Women's Democratic Club of Montgomery County. And I also really want to thank, from the bottom of my heart, End Citizens United, the Brennan Center for Justice, and the Office of Congressman Sarbanes, not only for their support for making this possible tonight, but for everything that they've been doing to keep our democracy safe. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. I don't want to spend any more time on the history of Do the Most Good, so I'm going to turn the spotlight over to Melissa Bush. Melissa is a member of the Do the Most Good executive team, and she's our moderator for the evening. And I just want you to know that in the aftermath of 2016, Melissa decided to dedicate most of her free time, of which she has very little, but it doesn't stop her, to help establish, nurture, and lead grassroots organizations. And her focus has really been to find ways for all of us to engage more fully in democracy. Thankfully, she's been able to apply her 25 years of experience in organizational leadership and management to help Do the Most Good and other grassroots groups organizations to launch canvases and plan democracy boot camps and build tools for grassroots organizing. So with that, Melissa, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Barbara. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this panel discussion. In the past 4 years, many of us have found ourselves engaged in political discussion with friends, with neighbors, with family, and we have all learned the painful but also the hopeful lesson that democracy is not a spectator sport. And I can say that I have learned that my assumption that there will always be qualified adults in the room looking out for the collective good was severely challenged. As painful as the past 4 years were, it did bring many of us together to stand up for our democracy and to fight for that democracy. As volunteers, we canvassed, we phone banked. Well, we used to canvass a lot. We phone banked, we wrote a heck of a lot of postcards, right? We wrote letters. We showed up at town halls. We got really smart about candidates. We raised money and we worked really hard to get what one of our grassroots co-sponsors groups calls extraordinary Democrats elected. And it was the first time we became interested in topics such as down ballot races in central Pennsylvania and the number of polling locations in Gwinnett, Georgia. Now we have a new administration. We have the Senate barely, and we have the House. But we know that this work isn't done. And we have not repaired our broken democracy or our democratic institutions, although we do have some reason to be hopeful. So we find ourselves turning now from elections to policy. The legislation we're going to talk about tonight, the For the People Act, will transform our democracy by making it fairer, stronger, and more inclusive. There is so much misinformation about this act. It's 800 pages long, right? There's a lot in it. So tonight is really dedicated about learning more. It's helping us become the smartest person in the room about it, because knowledge is power. And by the end of this evening, you will have so much more insight into this legislation. You will understand why it's possibly the most important piece of legislation in the past 40 years. And we will give you the resources to learn more, and more importantly, perhaps, the actions that you can take as an individual or within your grassroots groups to push this forward. So a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. I wish we were in a town hall together. That's like so much more fun, right? And this would be the time when we would be passing out those 3x5 cards to the audience so that you could write your questions down during the panel so that we could give it back to the panel. Well, we don't have those 3x5 cards, but we do have a Q&A feature. So in Zoom, you'll see the Q&A box. Please feel free to use that to write questions along the way, because we will be monitoring the Q&A so that we can be sure to push your questions to the panelists at the right time. It's possible we're not going to get to all of your questions, but we are going to try. We have questions that were given as part of your sign up. So we have those. We're going to have some of our folks are going to ask those questions throughout the evening. And we also have representatives from some of our grassroots teams who will be asking specific questions to the panelists. So we're going to have a lot of question and answer, but really first we need to do some learning. We need to get some background on this legislation. So we're going to start with Congressman John Sarbanes and Tiffany Muller really laying out the broad perspective of this legislation. And then we're going to ask Elizabeth Hira, who I'll introduce shortly, to give us some context, and give us really the civil rights context and the equity impact on this bill, because that is what really makes it, in my mind, so important. So let me go ahead and start my introductions. Congressman Sarbanes, I know you guys know him. Many of you know him, your constituents. He has represented Maryland's 3rd Congressional District since 2007. And he serves on various committees, including, since 2017, the Democracy Reform Task Force. And that's really the bold effort in the House of Representatives to build a government that really puts public interests ahead of special interests. And John feels passionately about this, and he talks a lot about it. And therefore, it is apropos that he is the actual sponsor of HR 1. So we're really thrilled to have him here. He is joined by Tiffany Muller, who is the president and executive director of End Citizens United and Let America Vote. Since joining ECU, Tiffany has helped grow the group from a startup to a nationwide organization with more than 4 million members and 800,000 grassroots donors. So this woman knows what she's doing. She, since its founding in 2015, ECU has raised over $135 million with an average contribution of $14. Under her leadership, the group has been elevated the issue of reforming Washington as a national priority, which has led to the introduction of the For the People Act. So this all very connected, the most comprehensive anti-corruption and democracy reform legislation in a generation. So and then finally, we have Elizabeth Hira, who is the Spitzer Fellow and Policy Counsel for the Brennan Center, focusing on large-scale democracy reform and centers equity. Elizabeth most recently worked as a lawyer for the US Congress, first for Senator Kamala Harris, developing federal policy on gender equity, civil rights, and later serving on the Committee on House Administration to develop the first version of HR 1 for the 116th Congress. So she knows this in and out, right? She has worked globally and domestically on equity for women and children and marginalized people. She holds her BA from Stanford and earned her JD right here at Georgetown Law. So we welcome your panel. I'm going to turn it over to the Congressman to get us started.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and do the most good. And thank you, Melissa, who, since I'm Greek American, I know you as Melissa Panagides, not Melissa Bush, but appreciate that kind introduction. And I'm thrilled to be joined tonight here with Tiffany Muller at End Citizens United. Tiffany and I have been working together very closely over the last few years, kind of crisscrossing the country, either in person or remotely, to spread the message of democracy reform. So thrilled that she's going to be part of the panel tonight. Elizabeth, all your friends at House Administration miss you and say hello. Elizabeth was there for round 1 of HR 1 a couple of years ago, and House Administration Committee is where most of the jurisdiction over HR 1 resides. So we work hand in glove with them to advance this legislation. So I'm going to just give some top line thoughts here, and then we'll continue on with the rest of the panel. Looking forward to the Q&A. I would say, if you look back at the November election, and thank you to all the people on this call for getting the good result in November, that was really the American people pulling our democracy back from the brink. That's how I characterize it. 80 million people decided that there's a better way forward. But if you look at what happened on January 6th with the attack on the Capitol, I think it's clear to everybody that the democracy we pulled back from the brink, and then, by the way, further energized with the lightning strike in Georgia that many of you helped with on January 5th. But that attack on the Capitol showed that our democracy is still very fragile. It needs a lot of care and attention and strengthening. And thankfully, we have something that could do that. HR 1, and now it's S1 on the Senate side, I'm glad to say, is something that's built to last. We put it together over the last 2 or 3 years. It very much represents a compilation of outstanding proposals to fix our democracy that have come forward over the last many years from people, for example, like John Lewis, whose Voter Empowerment Act is Title I of HR 1, which includes so many of the key voting reforms that we'll speak about tonight. But many other authors. In fact, I would say there's probably 70 to 80 members of the Democratic caucus who have some ownership, meaningful ownership of HR 1, the For the People Act, and have helped to propel it forward. So we think we're ready for this moment. And while, of course, we were frustrated in the 116th Congress after we passed this bill in the House by the fact that Mitch McConnell was never going to let it see the light of day on the Senate side, because, to be very candid, it will dismantle the power structure, the minoritarian power structure that he's built in this country. So he's obviously leaning hard against it. We have a new opportunity now because Democrats have the gavel in the House. In the Senate, we got a president who will sign this bill if we can get it to his desk. The stakes could not be higher You'll hear more tonight, and the Brennan Center has helped to catalog this over the last few weeks about what the Republican Party is doing at the state level. Already within the first few weeks of this year, over 160 pieces of legislation have been introduced by GOP state legislators across the country to roll back all of the modalities of voting that were so important to people when they fought their way to the ballot box in the 2020 election. So they're headed in absolutely the wrong direction. The good news is the reforms in HR 1 would stop that in its tracks. And we think that if we can get this bill passed in the early part of 2021, that we can get these reforms implemented in time to make a difference for the midterm elections. You helped win the last election, but you understand better than anybody that we win elections for a reason, and that's to go make important transformative policy. That's certainly the goal with HR 1, the For the People Act. I've been privileged not to author the bill, that's not how I like to put it, but to help assemble it, again, relying on the incredible work of our caucus over many, many years, which in turn is based on listening carefully to what the American people want to see. So let me give you a very short overview of the content of the bill, and then we can obviously delve into it more as the panel discussion moves forward. So basically, we've heard three or four real hard because they're shouting it at us, and they have been for a number of years. The first thing is we want to get to the ballot box without having to run an obstacle course every 2 years. It's crazy that America doesn't have the gold standard when it comes to voting here 50 years more or more after John Lewis shed blood on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, just marching for the right to vote. But we lag other peer nations when it comes to voting, and we have to fix that problem. And that's all people want to see. So we have right up front in HR 1 measures that would mandate automatic voter registration and same-day registration across the country, no excuse absentee ballot voting, a certain number of days of early voting, measures that would push back on voter purging, voter intimidation, voter suppression, the use of ID laws to disenfranchise people at the polls when they show up, and other measures just to make sure that it's a clear path. People should be able to get up in the morning, decide they want to go vote that day, and not have to make contingency plans for all the things that could go wrong. So that's at the center of like, let me get to the ballot box. Another critical piece is fixing partisan gerrymandering, because the public rightly gets very offended by the idea that they go to the polls and then somehow, because of the way the district lines get drawn, there's not fair representation in Congress when it comes time to cast votes. So that's just a matter of respect. And this bill would create independent redistricting commissions or require those to be set up in every state across the country so that voters pick the politicians instead of the other way around. So that's a key piece of it. Second major area of complaint from the public is when you go to Washington, behave yourselves. This goes to ethics, transparency, accountability, following conflict of interest rules, and just acting right. And we've got a lot of measures in there that create that ethical responsibility and enforce it, not just in the executive branch, but within the legislative and judicial branches as well. So that's a key piece of this. Another thing we heard from people is we're nervous about foreign interference. We're nervous about people hacking into our election infrastructure. There needs to be protections there. We need more transparency when it comes to how these digital platforms use advertising and so forth in the political space. So we've got many provisions there that would increase the sturdiness of our election infrastructure. And frankly, when you make us more resilient to foreign interference, that marries up very well to increased faith and trust in our democratic system. And then the last thing we heard from people, and we built a set of reforms to address this, is when you go to Washington, don't get tangled up in the money. Remember who sent you, where you come from, why you're there. That James Madison said that government should be dependent upon the people alone, not dependent on the insiders, the political donor class, the lobbyists, and the big money crowd. And so we have provisions that would create more transparency and disclosure of where the big money and secret money is coming from in our politics, really important. We fix the broken Federal Election Commission so it can actually be the cop on the beat that blows the whistle when the big money actors are crossing the lines in the last 6 months of every election cycle like they do right now. And there's no punishment for that. So we fix that problem. And my favorite, I've been working on this for 15 years, is we stand up a new system of funding congressional campaigns in America that's based on matching small donations, empowering campaigns that way. Why is that so important? Because elections cost a lot of money. And right now, most members of Congress and candidates running, in order to fund their campaigns, they've got to go to the high donors, to the PACs, to the well-heeled special interests, because that's the only way to make it happen. If we create this small donor matching system that puts a 6-to-1 match on average donations that come in, small donations, then candidates can turn to everyday Americans to power their campaigns, not go hat in hand to the lobbyists and the special interests. This would empower Americans, give them a sense of ownership. But just as importantly, it helps diversify the candidate pool, because there's a lot of terrific candidates right now who just can't access big money to start their campaigns. But if you hustle and you collect those small donations, you can actually run and compete and win. And that would change the makeup of the chamber, and it would change the kind of policy that we can get done. So that's it. Clear that path to the ballot box. Behave yourself in Washington. Don't get tangled up in the money. That adds up to about 750 pages of policy, but it's the big bang transformation that we need to see in our democracy. We think we can get this done. It's the hardest thing I've ever been part of, but I believe that if there is the will, there is a way, and that includes on the Senate side where the math is tricky. I think we'll come back and talk about that later. So let me stop and turn it over to, I guess, Tiffany, are you?
Yeah, turn it to Tiffany. And yes, and to that point, we do have a lot of questions about how it's going to get through the Senate. So we'll definitely get to that. So Tiffany.
All right. Well, first, thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Melissa, for putting this together. You are incredible, and it's such an honor to be here with you tonight. And Congressman Sarbanes, he may not like to call himself the author of HR 1, but there is no doubt about it. He is the architect of HR 1, and without his commitment, leadership, perseverance, grit, humor, we would not be where we're at today. There is no possibility of getting HR 1 done without him. So Congressman, it's always good to join you for these. And Elizabeth, thank you so much for all your leadership on this bill in multiple different roles. And I'm excited to be here with you. So hi, everyone. I am Tiffany Muller. I am the president of InCitizens United and Let America Vote. And we're going to run through a few short, simple slides to just talk about what's at stake and what we're facing right now. So let's just jump right in. So first, November 2020, despite all Republican efforts, actually had the highest voter turnout that we've ever seen. And then on January 6th, we saw a mob descend on our Capitol because of attacks on our democracy over the past 6 months. But we know it wasn't just about those attacks over the past 6 months. It's really been about the attacks that we've seen on our democracy over decades. The big money, the gerrymandering, the voter suppression. And there could not be a bigger divergence between how the two parties are addressing these issues right now. On the Democratic side, you have Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader Schumer, who have designated the largest democracy reform package as HR 1 and S1 in the House and Senate. And that's huge. That signifies it is our #1 top legislative priority. And they did that because it knows it impacts every other issue we want to work on. Climate change, immigration reform, gun violence background checks, prescription drug costs. All of it is on the line, and we have to restore voter faith and voter trust. And then you have the Republicans, who right now are on an unprecedented attack on voting rights. The Brennan Center just put out a report today that said that as of today, there are 253 bills introduced across 43 states that would restrict access to voting. 253. This is one of the largest assaults on voting rights that we've ever seen. Roughly half of those bills would put restrictions on who gets to vote by mail. Something that's always been bipartisan and supported in both red states and blue states. In Georgia alone, there are 40 different pieces of legislation to roll back voting rights, including getting rid of automatic voter registration, doing away with souls to the polls, doing away with who gets to vote by mail. So look, there is, and they're not even being coy about it. They are saying if voters turn out like they did in November 2020, then I don't see how any Republican can win. Direct quote from former Senator Kelly Loeffler down in Georgia. And it's pretty clear that in many instances, what they're doing is they're absolutely targeting Black and brown communities and trying to make sure that they don't have access to the ballot box. So, all right, next slide. Many of these, this is just, like I said, in Georgia, there's 40 different pieces of legislation, but we're seeing that all over the country and all over battleground states. Pennsylvania, there are over 14 different bills and 14 different hearings planned on election laws. In Arizona, they even have a bill introduced to override the Secretary of State's certification of the electoral votes. And Arizona has been a state that has always done vote by mail almost the longest. And they're trying to remove folks from the permanent mail-in voting rolls. So you can just see in battleground after battleground, New Hampshire, they want to keep students from voting. This has long been a way to try to suppress the vote in New Hampshire. And Senator Maggie Hassan, who's up for re-election this year, she only won her first race by 1,017 votes. And a big part of that was because students were allowed to vote, because that's where they live. So they are trying to change that in New Hampshire because they know it changes the electoral outcome. All right, next. All right, so gerrymandering. The congressman talked a little bit about this, but look, we are heading into a redistricting year, and frankly, everything's on the line. Over the last decade, because Republicans controlled so much of the map in 2010, Republicans have won on average 18 seats more in the House of Representatives every single election cycle than they should have. What that means is that actually in 2012, Democrats should have actually still held the House majority in 2012, but instead Republicans had it. Right now, our majority in the House should be closer to 20 seats than it is. Additionally, the independent analysis already shows that Republicans are set to gain about 6 seats just based off of redistricting, more than enough to wipe out the House Democratic majority. Next. So, but here's the thing, we have great news. HR 1, S1 fixes these problems, right? So first of all, let's talk about what it does on the voting side. It makes sure that every single state has automatic voter registration. Right now, 30 states don't have it. This would add 50 million new voters to the rolls, 50 million voters who would actually have access to the ballot. Same day voter registration. So let's pretend you move in between elections and you forgot to re-register, which, happens a lot. You can walk up to your polling place and you can register and update your registration on that same day. This increases youth turnout by 10%. And you can see some of the other increases too. This would prevent purges like those that we've seen, those targeted purges in Georgia, Wisconsin, Ohio. This outlaws those kind of purges. It would stop that extreme partisan gerrymandering. And it would say, look, we're not going to have map manipulation. We're going to have fair maps, fair districts where voters are choosing their elected officials rather than the other way around. It would restore voting rights for almost 4 million Americans nationwide, people who have served their time and who deserve to have their voting rights restored, and not allow the kind of process we've seen in Florida where voters said, yes, do this, and then they're continuing to hold it up. And it would combat the suppressive tactics from voter ID. Right now, 35 states have a photo ID law in place, but 18 states right now have a bill introduced to either strengthen voter ID laws or put a new voter ID law on the books. And we know that decreases turnout by almost 10%. This absolutely disproportionately hurts communities of color. Next slide. And some of my other favorites, everything in here is my favorite for me. I just got to be honest. But this makes sure that everyone across the country can vote by mail without having to have an excuse. That means that 76 million voters would suddenly be able to vote by mail who right now are in states where they say, no, you have to have an excuse, at a time when those same states are trying to strengthen the excuse needed to vote by mail. It would make sure everyone has at least 15 days of early voting before the election. I don't know about you, but my life gets a little crazy. Sometimes I need that extra wiggle room. We know that vote by mail increases turnout by 3%. We know that early voting increases turnout by 2%. And that's big. And you know, the money, and the money. You know, 2020 was a $14.5 billion election cycle, billion. That's more than double any previous election cycle that we've seen, including 2016 and 2018. And there has been over $1 billion of untraceable money that's come into our system, right? $1 billion. And so this bill shines a light on that dark money. It makes sure that there is transparency and accountability. When states have enacted these kind of disclosure laws, we've not only seen that light shine on it, but we have actually seen people then take money out of the system because frankly, not everyone wants that disclosure and transparency. And it would protect our elections from the foreign interference. And look, this bill is incredibly popular. Go to the next slide. This bill is incredibly popular. We actually just got out of the field with some new polling and research because I love data. And I can tell you 83% of Americans support this bill, 83%. It is rare to find 83% of people agreeing on anything. That includes 74% of Republicans and 73% of independents. This is not a partisan bill. The pieces in this bill are based on bipartisan support throughout history. We know that voters of all partisan stripes support this bill. These are common sense reforms that are needed. The only place this is partisan is in Capitol Hill. And that's because, you know, folks are trying to hold on to political power and rig the system so they can win an election. Next slide. And we know that the individual reforms within HR 1 are really, really popular. So some of the biggest are modernizing and securing our voting system to prevent hacking and disruption of elections. We also found that making sure there are accurate elections appealed to both Democrats and Republicans and independents. Additionally, the dark money transparency was incredibly popular. Prohibiting candidates from being able to benefit from unlimited money was very popular. And of course, ending partisan gerrymandering, right? Like people really understand how that's shutting down their voice. Next. Oh, that was it for me. So we are currently at a moment where we are seeing attacks on our democracy from all angles. And we have this once in a generation opportunity to pass this incredibly meaningful reform to do what we should do, which is give that power back to the people and restore power to their voices. But these opportunities don't last. They come along and you have to be able to take them. And that's why I'm so grateful for each and every one of you who joined the call tonight, because I know that it's because you care about these issues and you're ready to help us create the force and create the momentum needed to get this over the finish line. So thank you so much. I look forward to Q&A.
All right, Tiffany, thank you so much. All right, Elizabeth, let's talk about this legislation and really what does it mean for people, for communities, and particularly for civil rights. Wait, you're on mute still. There you go.
Just wanted to start by saying thank you so much for having me, and to Mr. Sarbanes, you've just been such a tireless champion, and every time we've ever needed you to stand up for really all of America, you have, and so I've been incredibly grateful, both as a resident of Maryland, but also somebody who had the pleasure of working with you guys. And I will say I spent most of the holiday last year with Mr. Sarbanes' staff, more than my family. So I'm always been an advocate for this bill, and I'm glad to continue to be so. Tiffany, it's the second time I've seen you today because I got to watch your amazing presentation earlier. You guys are tireless fighters. And to Melissa and Claudia and all the folks who put this together, thank you so much. But really, my biggest thank you is to all of you who are listening right now when you could be doing so many other things because you are making this possible, right? And so my hope is by the end of our little chat today, you will be one of those people who, just like me, are one of those kind of people who show up on your doorstep being like, do you have 2 minutes for me to talk to you about HR1? Because once you learn about what's in here, it is impossible not to keep telling the story and to keep asking other Americans to join you in that effort. So I think to that end, I was thinking about the way that we actually can tell people about what's in this bill. So it's 791 pages, and I encourage you to read it in case you want to, induce a coma. But if you actually want to hear about what's going on in it, the thing that I've discovered is that we can talk to people about this bill as the single greatest democracy reform we've seen in America since the Civil Rights Movement. And to kind of back up that very lofty claim, I have decided that we're basically talking about bookends, right? So there are 3 things that I think this bill is really doing. And the first one is picking up the work of the Civil Rights Movement. So the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, we have very unfortunately been able to see firsthand that a lot of the invidious discrimination and a lot of the kind of just hurtful hatred that has existed in this country for centuries and has persisted through decades of formal enfranchisement have persisted until this day. And so there's a lot of work done to just stop really racism, sexism, patriarchy, homophobia, all of that stuff that still exists. And this bill has a lot of features to kind of carry that through into a modern democracy. The second thing it does is what I like to think of as all that stuff that you're like, how is this still happening in 2021? So when you're seeing these crazy voter lines, when you're seeing the kids say like my ID kind of worked here, but it didn't work here. And everybody's just going, why is this even happening? Don't we have the internet? How is this possible? This bill fixes a lot of that stuff. And so it's just common sense reform. And so when people complain, why is the bill so big? It has so much stuff in it. I'm always like, it's crazy that Congress is doing its job. It's fixing all these basic things that we should just fix to have a functioning democracy. Which brings me to the third part. So not only is it fixing this bad stuff and fixing this facially neutral, but also bad stuff, the third thing it's actually doing is proactive work to build an inclusive and reflective democracy. What would it look like if we didn't have to worry about beating back attacks on people's voting rights and actually got to say, hey, I'm seeing somebody who looks like me, I'm seeing a working parent just like me, and suddenly all the baseline things that I'm always asking about why that's not happening, again, in a developed nation, are suddenly on the table and actually being addressed. And so those are the 3 kinds of ways that I think about HR1. And I have structured the way I'm going to chat with you today, not on the data and the sections, which I'm happy to chat with you about, but actually on kind of anecdotes that I think represent how each of those pieces are important. And I hope that some of these stories might stick with you, because the thing I need you to do is talk to everybody you know about this bill and why it's so important. So when it's moving, it's not just another thing that Congress may or may not do, but it's actually a thing that creates a foundation that makes the rest of the work possible that we need to do. And not only over the next 2 years, or the next 4 years, but frankly, to build a future in a coming out of a pretty perilous time. So with that, I will kind of make the disclaimer that the Brennan Center, who I'm so proud to represent, is nonpartisan. We don't think of this as a partisan bill. Democracy is good for America, and it doesn't belong to a party. And so we're really thrilled to kind of represent that position. So to come back to that first bookend that I was talking about, the Civil Rights Movement, and I don't think I really need to belabor the point about the discrimination that folks are really seeing, but I will give you a couple of quick hits about how we see sometimes hate and discrimination really translated into the law directly. So I don't know if you guys remember, in 2012, North Carolina had one party take over the majority, and we actually saw some state legislative staff start to ask around quietly behind the scenes, hey, what were the methods that were used to vote broken down by race? And so what they got was a list of the ways that it was most popular for white and Black and brown voters to be able to vote. And then once Shelby County v. Holder gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, what we saw in North Carolina was a bill called the Monster Law that one by one knocked out all of the ways that Black and brown voters had been voting. So we'd seen that Black people were disproportionately being represented in early voting in North Carolina. Guess what? Early voting disappears. Black voters had organized through their churches buses for elderly congregants to go from church. They'd get in their little bus and then they'd go to the polls, called Souls to the Polls. Well, this new bill in North Carolina said, well, there won't be any voting on Sundays. And what does that do? It gets rid of Souls to the Polls, to the point that when the Fourth Circuit was actually looking at the effects of this law, ultimately, they said that the law clearly targeted African Americans with surgical precision. So it knocked out the law, which is great, problem solved, right? Well, no, because counties are still in charge of what actually happens in those states. And what we see currently is because counties have control and there is no national standard about things like early voting sites have just been eliminated at historically Black colleges and universities across the entire state of North Carolina. And we know what kind of effect that has when our young people are watching and saying, well, we're supposed to have a role, we're supposed to have an opportunity to play, but as Tiffany said, you're putting up all these obstacles constantly. So that's just kind of one quick example. Another an example that's really horrible, but I think is again, illustrative. In 2017, when North Dakota was looking at setting up a voting ID in their state, they actually got intel from their Secretary of State that it would disproportionately impact Native American voters. And as a result, passed the law to disproportionately impact Native American voters. And then they said, well, this should be fine because we're going to require that addresses show up on your ID, which should be fine, except that they well knew the government didn't give addresses to voters who lived on reservations. There wasn't even an opportunity for people to have a chance to participate under that kind of law. So I just throw those out as kind of quick ways that we can see what looks like a facially neutral, very sensible law ends up sometimes being architected with the deliberate intent to hurt marginalized communities and often has that intent. Same things like in the recent elections when we saw folks, it was really scary at Brennan. So many people just asked like, hey, when President Trump asked the Proud Boys to show up at the polls, is that legal? That shouldn't be a question that you as an American voter have. And guess what? That question is answered in HR 1. Voter intimidation is illegal and the penalties are really strong and they're strengthened by HR 1. Same thing, you shouldn't have to wait in line for 10 hours if you need to vote. Solved by HR 1 with early voting. The voter ID laws that I talked about actually are solved by HR 1. If a state wants to require voter ID, that's fine. What HR 1 actually does is mandate that you also be able to just make sworn testimony to say, hey, it's me, I'm putting my name on my oath. Like that should suffice instead of voter ID. So it's really full of these clever sort of common sense things that solve a lot of these problems. And I'll quickly just say to kind of wrap up this piece, that a lot of the stuff that we see, again, that looks facially neutral actually is rooted in discriminatory historical context. So the quickest hit that I think will illustrate this is that voter registration laws did not exist at the beginning of America, right? It actually turns out that voter registration laws had this huge arc after the passage of the 15th Amendment. Once we suddenly had Black voters eligible to work in the United States or eligible to vote in the United States, voter registration laws showed up. And those voter registration laws continued well through the immigration period of the 1920s. And we've had legal historians simply say that voter registration laws were created to control the Black and brown opportunities to vote, to the point that Texas had a trigger law in 1949 that said, hey, if the poll tax is abolished constitutionally, we immediately will institute voter registration. It's a one-to-one connection. And I think what looks like common sense stuff to us now, the minute we start to poke around in history, sometimes reveals itself as a little more thick than we thought it had been. Melissa, I'm mindful of time and clearly I can go on about this forever. But let me just skip quickly to the next two. For the second one, the kind of common sense solution stuff, I'm gonna quickly illustrate through, again, voter ID laws. In Texas, you can use your gun license to vote. You cannot use your student ID to vote. What that means is something fun when you look at things like race, because guess what? Over half of the students in the university's Texas system are minorities. Over 80% of the folks who got a gun license in Texas in 2018 were white folks. Same thing for trans people. There are 1.4 million trans people in America. Over 965,000 of them are eligible to vote. 42% of them don't have a voter ID that reflects their gender identity. And as we know, living in the climate we do, a lot of people don't even want to show up to show their ID and maybe get rejected because they may not have the same name or the same look that they do on their ID. And this one would kind of knock my socks off. So 66% of women don't have ID that reflects their actual name. Because in America, 80% of women, we think according to the Times recently, 80% of us change our name upon marriage or divorce, but we don't always update our government documents. And so those women are being potentially left out when they go to the polls. And then the final thing that always kind of blows my mind is that currently 11 states, so the takeaway there is that voter ID laws have these effects on all these communities. It's not just kind of black and white and civil rights history, it's current stuff that's happening today. Kids are being left out in the way that we're doing things currently. And right now, young people are incredibly motivated to vote. Actually, in April of 2018, millennials and Zoomers came together to become the largest voting bloc in America. millennials and Zoomers have more voting power than boomers. And they are, for the first time in American history, almost 50% non-white. They are the most diverse and the most educated generation in American history, and they're incredibly politically engaged. And even in light of that, in 11 states, you can't register to vote on the internet. You have to go find paper and a stamp and go somewhere. And so like, we're not making it possible for young people to actually participate. And that's an example of a facially neutral thing that ends up having these really negative impacts. So with that, I will skip to my third favorite thing, which is the kicker, which is like, what would it look like if our democracy reflected our people? And that's, I think, the brilliance of this entire bill. So Mr. Sarbanes talked about small dollar financing, and there's some other incredible pieces of the bill that I'll discuss. But I think I just want to lay the foundation here with a quick survey of what our country actually looks like right now. We have the most diverse Congress in the United States history. Super exciting. It is 79% white and barely 1 in 4 women. The most diverse Congress in American history. And the things I like to add to that are like, it's not just racial and gender diversity. Fewer than 5% of Congress people have ever had a blue collar job. As you know, more than half of Americans are $400 away from a crisis. More than half of Congress are millionaires. We are not being reflected in the leadership that we currently have. Oh, and my personal favorite, which I think is kind of incredible and maybe explains why we don't have things like paid leave. Women in Congress only got their own bathroom in the House of Representatives in 2011. Prior to that, they had to go away from the floor, away from votes to be able to use the public restrooms. And in the history of Congress, only 10 people have ever given birth while serving as Congresspeople. So when you think about paid family leave, you might not wonder why that experience isn't reflected in how people see. I give that long thing just to say, clearly it's not a one-to-one. You know, women are not a monolith, people of color are not a monolith, young people are not a monolith. We don't all represent the same issues. But if we have capture by a very small group of people who get to make decisions that matter for everyone, we don't actually get policy that represents everyone. And we definitely don't get policy that benefits everybody. So I'll quickly just close up by saying like what Mr. Sarbanes was talking about with smaller public financing, it really matters for regular candidates because like we know that women and women of color, for instance, have huge problems raising for their congressional campaigns. That on average, Black congressional candidates, women in the last cycle raised a third for all of the money that their counterparts raised. So it's really just hard to break through. And one of my other favorites is in the history of the Senate, 1,789 senators, there have been 57 women. 5 of those people have been women of color. And as Melissa mentioned, I had the privilege of working for one of them. She's broken a glass ceiling that we've been waiting for 200 years to actually get broken. When we show up, when we run, we win at the same rates. And when we win, we achieve things for the United States of America. So I hope that that's a little bit of a teaser of what's actually happening.
Wow.
So I'm happy.
Okay, this is so good. This is so good. So we know a lot. I mean, hopefully everybody's feeling the download of what's in this bill and why it's important. So I'm going to turn it over to Sophie Isbell. She is our first questioner. She is a member of the Do the Most Good, and she is the co-lead of the national team, and she is a junior at Pace University, pursuing a double major in women and gender studies and a BFA in acting. Sophie, over to you for the first question to our panel.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here and speaking on this important bill. To get started, I want to address, so as we know, there's a 50-50 split in the Senate, and with the difficulty in eliminating the filibuster altogether, I wanted to know your thoughts on what alternative strategies you view as the most likely approach to move this legislation forward, or what alternative approaches in general are being considered.
Yeah, let me start. Well, the principal strategy is that we are going to make it as uncomfortable as we possibly can for the Senate to avoid making this happen. Let's put it that way. We start that process coming out strong from the House with passage of this bill, which we hope is going to happen next week. We have all members of the Democratic caucus as co-sponsors of HR 1, which we achieved in the last Congress, so that's awesome. We want our vote in the House to be a powerful redeclaration that this is what the public wants to see. This package is interlocking. We want to keep it together because it exerts a gravitational pull when all components of it are working together. When we get to the Senate side, there's no question that there's going to have to be an evaluation of the filibuster and the obstacle that that presents. Now, I'm not an expert on the Senate rules. I don't pretend to be, and I frankly don't want to be, but I think they're going to have to figure out a way to address the fact that there right now is a supermajority requirement that could end up thwarting efforts to restore majority rule in America, which on its face is kind of jarring. So I think what could happen, and this is plan A and plan B and plan C for the moment, is that the appetite for democracy reform will begin to merge with the appetite for filibuster reform. Those will become aligned in a powerful way, and that can be what gets us across the finish line. So at this stage, the message is HR 1 is what we need. We have to push forward. We have to demand that from lawmakers in Washington. And if there was ever an argument available to senators that you need to follow through on this, it's that the state that gave you control of the United States Senate, Georgia, is the state that you need to pay attention to in terms of the legacy of John Lewis, who is at the center of HR 1, as he is at the center of the Voting Rights Advancement Act. So we think there's a very powerful narrative that can carry over to the Senate side and help advance the bill there. And that's our story, and we're sticking to it.
Okay, any other comments from our other panelists on this?
I would just say, I mean, a lot of the questions have asked about this, and with good reason. And I would just say that I'd like to take folks back to 2017 when Republicans won a trifecta, right? And they had the House, they had the Senate, they had the White House, and the very first thing they were going to do was repeal healthcare, repeal the Affordable Care Act. They had been promising it for almost a decade, running an election campaign after election campaign on it, and everyone thought it was impossible to stop, that there was no way to stop it. And guess what? That wasn't true. We did stop it by organizing, by lifting voices, by making it super uncomfortable on people, by forcing a recognition that where they were at on the Senate floor was not where the people were at. And that matters, because the things that are more powerful than money in politics or gerrymandering is the people, because at the end of the day, they are very concerned about their voter backlash. So we have to make sure they feel that discomfort. We have to raise our voices. We have to organize. We have to make sure voters know why this bill helps their day-to-day life. So we have work to do. And I would say, don't let where we're at today in the Senate in any way dissuade you from the importance and the critical nature of this bill and what we can create together.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth, any comment?
I just want to add quickly that again, we should not concede that it has to be a solely one party bill, because democracy belongs to everybody. And something that we learned certainly from the Tea Party onward through movements across the Trump administration is that people respond to local pressure, right? Jeff Flake moves people. And so I challenge all of you on this call to actually not concede away territory and write your senator and say, hey, I saw Marco Rubio wrote that the Republican Party needs to open up its tent and diversify. This bill would help it diversify. Why don't you get behind it with us, right? So I encourage you, your friends across the aisle and your senators, to encourage them to come along too. Don't give up ground you don't have.
Great. Yeah, we have lots of actions we're going to talk about at the end. So perfect. Great. Thank you so much, Sophie. Is there anything else that you wanted to follow up with?
If I can just follow up very briefly,
Yeah.
just sort of bringing, and I hate to be so specific about this, but bringing your attention back to the likelihood of this going through the Senate. So you mentioned the idea of the supermajority. We've talked about the filibuster and the supermajority getting in the way. Do you see something like, so for example, Norm Ornstein suggested a rule change from 41 votes to continue the debate rather than 60 to end it. Do you see something like that happening between now and when it goes through, or just basically touching on the likelihood of it going through the Senate?
I would just say this. There are a lot of different ways to skin a cat when it comes to filibuster reform. You don't have to get rid of it completely. The majority has the ability and the power over there, and that's the majority of 50+1 with Kamala Harris, to figure out what the rules are they're going to apply. So there's maybe 3, 4, 5 different proposals that are being considered about how you kind of step back and restructure the filibuster that could allow legislation to move forward that otherwise would be stopped. So that conversation is happening. I think it's promising, but as Tiffany said, and as Elizabeth said, the most important part of this campaign is for the people to step in and say, we have to have this change, and we're not going to take no for an answer. We're not going to get this chance for another 50 years to do this kind of change, and we haven't had it for 50 years. So we cannot let this moment go.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, our next question is from Roxanne Rucker. She's a part of the leadership of Indivisible Waterfront. Indivisible Waterfront has been around since 2016 and focuses on electoral politics and voter rights, particularly in Virginia and Pennsylvania. Indivisible Waterfront will be fully engaged in Virginia in 2021, and Roxanne was very involved in efforts to increase turnout at the polls among voters of color. So Roxanne, could you please ask your question to the panel?
Yes, and thank you for the opportunity this evening, and thank you for your presence. Hey, you know, I oftentimes feel like progressives and Democrats seem to have maybe a little bit of a communication problem, and somehow we fail to capture the attention and buy-in of the American people on the very policies that may benefit them the most. And I'll just raise as an example the other side of this coin that we're talking about, but Republicans up and down the ballot have elevated voter fraud and election integrity to the point that what is really a non-issue for many is now perceived as this real and present danger. We even saw how these attacks on vote by mail and early voting may have contributed to some degree to dampening of Republican turnout in the Georgia special runoff elections, you know, maybe costing them the 2 seats. So how do we communicate the For the People's Act in a way that appeals broadly to all Americans? And I think what I'm looking for is, you know, what's our catchphrase? What's our pithy equivalent to election integrity and voter fraud?
Tiffany, you got all this polling at your fingertips. Why don't you talk about messaging?
Sure, I'm always happy to. So I don't have the bumper sticker phrase yet, and I'm gonna hope that all of you on this can help us figure out what that next for the people, you know, defending our democracy or whatever the bumper sticker phrase needs to be. But I can tell you this, the messages that tested the best in the recent research that we did were really about self-serving politicians continuing to stack the deck through voter suppression and extreme gerrymandering to hold on to power at any cost. Meanwhile, those same politicians prioritize the corporate special interests that contribute big money to campaigns and buy elections, giving them the power to stand in the way of fixing problems like healthcare, prescription drug costs, and making the economy work for everyone, not just those on top. Look, what it comes down to is, who is Washington going to work for? Is it going to work for the self-serving politicians or the big donors, or is it going to work for you and for your family? And that's really what the messaging has shown time and time again is the most powerful messages.
And I would just say on the voting stuff, I mean, when they talk voter integrity, we should talk voter access. This is about creating access for people to get to the ballot box. And when you say access, then you describe all the ways. You can vote by mail, you can vote early, you can vote on election day. You can register easily on the same day, automatically, online, etc. That's all about access, and access appeals to people across the political spectrum. So they obviously want to push this narrative of fraud and voter integrity and so forth. But most people understand that that's a false narrative. And the idea of improving access, curbing voter suppression is something that's very real to many people out there in the country. And I think that that is one way to respond on that particular issue of voting.
Great. Elizabeth, I know you have lots of opinions on messaging and misinformation.
My family tells me all the time that I need to remember the Democrats talk too damn much. So part of our problem is that it's hard to fit our brilliant, complex, nuanced ideas onto bumper stickers. And so for exactly that reason, Roxanne, I look at these three parts of this bill, and what I say is that this is a gumbo. It has literally something for everybody. So you figure out who you're talking to, and you figure out because you're all educated about what's in this bill, you can figure out what will appeal to them. So for the first part, I just was on a call today with some brilliant people saying what actually works for people is the freedom to vote. Because when we talk about rights, it seems like it's restrictive. When we talk about freedom, it's like, oh, well, that belongs to you. Don't let your state government go putting its little fingers in that. The freedom to vote resonates with people. I think protecting our elections is the second part. So this whole second part of the bill is about election integrity and election security. So you say we're protecting elections. We're making sure that there's paperless ballots, or there are paper ballots and trails for things. We're shoring up state governments with money to make sure that they're protected against cyber attacks, right? And then the third part, this ethics stuff, is like just drain the swamp, right? So drain the swamp has been kind of taken by Republicans, and yet we're seeing them, do that rotating door, revolving door that we're always talking about. And this bill very clearly just says, like, what if Washington had ethics requirements? So I think trying to come up with your bumper sticker version of it is possible, and you just think about what the reforms are. And again, I think don't forget the bill has enough big ticket items within it that you can pick and choose what's really great. We didn't even mention democracy restoration, right? The United States has so many people who have been incarcerated, way outside 20% of the world's population of incarcerated people. 4 million people would get their vote back under HR 1, right? So and I'm so happy to answer these questions. Please reach out, I'm sure, to any of us on the after. You tell me what your thing is, and I'm happy to make you a bespoke set of talking points for your friends and family, as I'm sure every person who cares about this bill is, because there's something in there for everybody.
Great, good, thank you. Thank you, Roxanne. Any follow-up, Roxanne?
No, thank you. And I'm glad that Elizabeth addressed some of the different ways to talk about it. I particularly like freedom to vote and maybe even reclaiming drain the swamp.
Yeah, like it. Good, great, thank you. Fabulous. Okay, so our next question is from Lisa Fuller, and Lisa Fuller is the founder of MoCA Women. She founded it in 2017, and its mission is to empower Maryland's diverse community at the grassroots level and encourage citizens to become engaged participants in their democracy at the state, local, and national level. Lisa, would you like to give your question to the panelists?
Sure. Hi. I want to first thank Do the Most Good for bringing us all together tonight, and the panel. Thank you so much. I don't know if you're seeing in the chat how much everyone has appreciated how you explain this to us. I started to read the bill. I think I got to page 5, and then I went to the summary because I actually held the bill in your office, Representative Sarbanes, 4 years ago. I came to Capitol Hill and it was sitting there, and you let me hold it. But hearing you speak in regular language about why we have to pass this bill has given me a lot of comfort, because now I can explain it to other people. My question was sort of answered by you already, but there was a question in the chat from Don Moldover, and I'm going to ask this question for him. Even if the bill passes, I'm going to say when the bill passes and gets signed, won't the states still pass their state-by-state restrictions and fight it out in the courts? And then I'll just add, what do you think the courts would do? That's my question.
We've got people well equipped to answer that, but very quickly, all of these voting reforms are ones that we have authority to put in place with respect to federal elections. But as a practical matter, states will have to implement them with respect to state elections, because there's no functional capacity to run basically 2 different sets of elections when it comes to voter registration requirements, when it comes to mail-in voting, early voting, et cetera. So we're using the authority that we have under the Time, Place, and Manner Clause of the Constitution and the congressional authority to regulate federal elections to, in a sense, leverage these standards across the board. And so we're very confident that a lot of the mischief we're seeing now at the state level can be stopped in its tracks if we get HR 1 passed, particularly if we can get it passed relatively early in this cycle and have it deployed in time for the 2022 midterm.
Thank you.
Tiffany or Elizabeth, any follow-up?
I just want to add that a lot of the bill, there's just this concept of federal preemption, right? So as Mr. Sarbanes says, we have constitutional authority to do some regulation on federal elections. And there are some things, like I was just looking at the list of stuff that's coming out of Georgia, and it almost just feels like they're scrapping, like they're trying really hard because they know change is coming. And so what you actually see is stuff that just says, hey, you said automatic voter registration, no automatic voter registration. And that works practically is that the bill will pass the United States Congress, Joe Biden will sign it into law, and then those states, basically Secretary of State gets to make a choice. Am I going to waste our state's dollars and our taxpayer dollars to go litigate this when it's very clearly just preempted by this federal law? Or am I going to go ahead and just get into line? And I think that once you see this passage happen, people will say, oh, geez, we're able to functionally govern. Why don't we get to the stuff of governing instead of litigating backwards? So for most of the bill, it's a pretty clear cut, like federal law will trump state law, and we'll just move forward from there.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Lisa, any follow-up?
No, that's great. Federal law trumps state law. I love it. I'm writing it down.
Okay, all right. Maybe that's the bumper sticker.
Yeah, maybe.
That's the only use of the word Trump we're
I
going to.
know,
I know, right?
small t people.
We'll find something better.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so our next question is from Silver Spring Progressive Action, and it's a relatively young group focused to tip tight elections and ensuring that those elections are fair and accessible. They focused exclusively on electoral politics and on issues that affect fair voting. This year, their priorities include strengthening the Democratic majority in the Virginia House, so Virginia is a big focus for us, and setting the stage to protect and, if possible, expand congressional majorities in 2022. And like all of us, for the passing the For the People Act. I'd like to introduce Mykesha McNorton. She's a volunteer with SSPA, and she's responsible for coordinating the outreach efforts for passing the For the People Act. Mykesha, would you give your question to the panel, please?
Yeah, hello. Thank you so much for allowing me to be on today. I really enjoyed all the conversation. So I believe my question has already kind of been asked. I was just wondering about what is the congressional oversight? We've seen that states, if they don't agree, they may just try to do their own thing. And even though this is sort of like a common sense law, how are we making sure that, states are complying with this? Because I'm going to go with positivity when it is passed.
Well, that's a great question. And we've built a lot of provisions into the bill to allow us to continue to learn from experience and make sure that there's always a next generation of best practices. So there's all kinds of audit, like post-election audit provisions that are included in here to look at how voting was done. There's something called the Election Assistance Commission that's funded by the Help America Vote Act, which is sort of the federal agency that connects to how voting is happening and looking at those best practices across the country. They'll be even further empowered to take a hard look at this and do that oversight, make recommendations going forward. So there's no question that we're trying to make this a kind of continuous, virtuous cycle of improvement in terms of our elections. But wouldn't it be wonderful if the data we're collecting is not just about how things are broken, but how things are really working well, and our opportunity to do that is going to come from getting this bill passed on the front end. So it's a great question, and we've definitely thought that through.
Great.
Sorry, any follow-up, you guys?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, good. So we have been, as we have been going today, I don't know if you guys can see the Q&A and the chat have like exploded. So we have lots and lots of questions. And so am I going back to Sophie for another question, Claudia, or am I, or do we have a question from the chat that we're going to?
Sophie's got a couple questions right now.
Okay, Sophie, would you please follow up with the panelists, please?
Yes, so I'm going to take this opportunity because I think that they're going to be brief, and I think each of you is going to offer a different perspective to bring up two things that have been brought up in the chat. The first is, will this be will this be SCOTUS proof? Basically, what is the Supreme Court? How are they related to it? Just to touch on that briefly. And also, this goes back to my other question, which is that one of the tactics you've named as the best way to forward this legislation is getting the mainstream media talking about it. How do we get the mainstream media talking about it? How do we get this trending on social media? How do we get people engaged in this other than wonderful panels like this, in which we bring together a great group of people who are very engaging? So the two questions are, how is it related to the Supreme Court? And how do we get people talking about this?
So let me do 30 seconds. It is SCOTUS proof. We've gone through the bill very carefully. We put in language which anchors its constitutionality. We think it will fare very well against any kind of challenge, and inevitably there will be challenges, but we've thought that through. And in fact, some of the extra language we added in this round was for that very purpose, to make sure it could withstand any constitutional challenge. In terms of mainstream media paying attention to this, the good news is that just in the last 6 weeks, that is happening. There are plenty of articles beginning to appear. I want to thank Brennan, because their cataloging of the GOP playbook, rolling all this back at the state level, has been a real hook for a lot of reporters to finally focus on what's happening with HR1, S1. So there's plenty of material we can send you that you can then point people to. You can share that link because the bill is being sort of captured and presented in a lot of different frames by a lot of columnists and reporters that you'd be familiar with. And I think you can share that based on, where you think it'll make an impact.
Great. And we'll show you, we have a portal that we're going to put together with all this information. So we'll go there shortly, but I wanted to see if Elizabeth or Tiffany had a follow-up for Sophie about both SCOTUS, which I think we have a definitive answer on, and then the idea of how do we make this, how do we clang the bell on this?
Yeah, well, I'm totally going to defer to the Congressman and Elizabeth on the SCOTUS question. But absolutely, we can help continue to increase and amplify the buzz around this bill, and we have to. We have definitely seen mainstream media asking about it more and more on interviews, but the way that they're going to ask about it even more is if people are calling their senators, calling their representatives, talking about it on social media, writing letters to the editor, asking the question in town halls. The way that you get the media to talk about the thing you want them to talk about is for you to talk about it even louder, even more. And so I know that the portal is going to have lots of links to those actions and how to take those actions. But I will tell you, reaching out to your local media, doing those letters to the editor, reaching out if you see something in your local media, reaching out to the correspondents or the reporters and offering to be another voice on this. Those things are really, really important, and we can provide you talking points on them as well. So that's what we have to do. You have to text family and friends. We gotta email all of our networks. We have to do that organizing, just like you all have been doing.
Yeah, I'm gonna say this is
kind of
what we've been doing for 4 years. So.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
And I, like all of you, I don't know about you all, I am tired after the last 4 years, and we can't give up yet. We got to just dig a little deeper. We got to just go a little bit longer because we literally, our democracy is at stake. So no pressure at all.
Yep. Hey, how about you, Elizabeth? Thoughts?
I think just thinking about what Tiffany said, it's almost like I like to think of these last, we did all the struggle of being pregnant and going through delivery, and we're gonna get the baby. And the baby, this is the thing we're all waiting for. And so the hard work comes to something here. For SCOTUS, obviously, Mr. Sarbanes, that's what all the work is that all these people have been putting in to make sure that this is airtight. Don't conceive the argument when they say this is a power grab. It's actually no, it's giving people power. It's giving the American people power. That's the answer. And then for what we need to do, again, when I watched this pass the last time, I was elated, and I watched the New York Times just say, hey, I think the Democrats did some good governance thing on page 4. You could have knocked me with a feather. And we were doing such hard work and such brilliant stuff, and it's what America's been waiting for. Now with round 2, we're actually playing with live ammo, and Tiffany's exactly right. We need you doing all the things you've already been doing. But talk about it like a civil rights bill. Talk about it like an election security bill. Figure out what's going to work for your folks around you, and let them know this is our next ACA. It's our next family separation. It's the thing we need to show up for. it is the only way we're going to get everything done that we need to moving forward.
Let me just give you an example of how this works when you raise the temperature. Joy Reid just asked Ron Klain, who's the White House Chief of Staff, about HR 1, and Ron Klain said, we strongly support HR 1. Joy Reid's asking the question because she's feeling it get more traction all around her. That's coming from the kind of chorus that is happening at the grassroots. The fact that Ron Klain now said that will light up other things, and that will begin to feed on itself. So we're in that moment where this is becoming organic, and the more you can contribute to it, the better, because we got to make this happen.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, let's go to, I know people are beginning to ask for the resources. So let's Aaron, let's show the portal. We put together a information resource portal, and it will be something that we will curate over time. We will send you the link in the chat. It's just a portal. There's nothing, you know, it sends you to different places. So the first section is really take action. That's where we've tried to catalog the kinds of things that you can do. This is where we are pointing you to resources for how to write letters to the editor. This is where we're sharing talking points. You have a learn more section, which is all these incredible reports and resources from across, you know, all the Brennan Center stuff is there. The End Citizens United reports, all kinds of things. We have given you the key messages. Here are some key messages that you heard echoed today to make your own and to dig a little bit deeper. And Elizabeth, we might take you up on the bespoke model of this, but you know, generally this is a good starting point. The starting place. Start here. You have links to all the organizations that are involved in this kind of thing. And as we find more, I'm sure there are more, we will add the links there. And then below we have the policy overview. So this is like section by section, bits and pieces about the policy. And then we have links to our very own Representative Sarbanes' video collage, 4-part video series on all aspects of HR 1. So this is him talking about HR 1 in little bite-sized pieces about the various provisions. So it's a way to refresh your memory. And then if you really want more, you have a link to the full text of HR 1 and then a section by section breakdown. So there you have everything you need about HR 1 in one place. The whole idea here is to make it a one-stop shop for you. We will be curating this. We will be adding materials. I was looking for some news, like as we get some social media, maybe as we get some news articles, we'll post those on here as well, so we can continue to follow it. Okay. So again, the link to the HR portal is in the chat. Visit it, go back, come back, and we will continue to have the dialogue about HR 1S1, the progress of this from now until we pass it. And then when Biden signs it, we'll put the video clip of him doing that at the very end. That'll be the end of this portal. Okay. So with that, what time are we at? We're at 8 more minutes. So let me just ask if there's any more questions. Claudia, do I have any more questions from the chat that we need to ask? One more question before we leave.
So the one question that keeps coming up is there any Republican support and why not?
Yes, so let me take that. If you judge Republican support by looking at various components of the bill, you'd say yes, because many of the things we've incorporated in there are things that were introduced on a bipartisan basis. If you judge the bipartisan support for the bill by looking at the polling that Tiffany shared with you out in the country, you would say, yeah, this is bipartisan, but as she said, by every measure across the political spectrum. The problem we have is that the Republican leadership in Washington, and that's McCarthy and McConnell, have in a sense decreed to their party ranks, to the rank and file, that you shall not go anywhere near HR 1. And this is because they've gotten attached to the power structure that represents for their party. And they're going to continue to lean against it, and they're going to call in all of the powerful forces and money groups behind them to enforce that decree. Now, that doesn't mean we're not, as Elizabeth said earlier, always looking for that support from rank and file members, and we continue to make that pitch to them. It's just to say that we're not going to depend on that for the outcome here, but certainly we'll continue to pursue this as representing bipartisan appetite in the country. And ultimately, what we need to do is break down the doors that Mitch McConnell has locked for the last 15, 20 years when it comes to our democracy. And I think we're there. So that's my view of the Republican Democratic dynamic.
Sorry, and you know, I think we're telling people also, if you have a representative who is not for this bill, you still contact them, you still ask them why. You know, we're still having to give pressure, you know, explain to me, you know, holding people accountable, just like we did with healthcare, to be honest. You know, we showed up at the town halls. We don't have town halls so much anymore, but it was really that pressure, and there's no reason why we can't extend that to the Republicans as well. And we can't, like somebody said, don't concede, right? All right, so I'm going to give it to Elizabeth and Tiffany. You guys have the last word. Just say the final thoughts for the night, and then we will consider it a wrap.
Well, I'm going to make Elizabeth go last. I'm going to jump in here, make her have the last word. Well, look, I first want to thank you all for having me tonight, for putting together this incredible event. Another thank you to Congressman Sarbanes, again, for all of his tireless leadership partnership on this. Elizabeth, you're incredible. Thank you for all of your work on this issue. To all of you who spent the evening with us, it is clear how much you are already fighting for the future of our country. You have been doing the hard work, and we are currently in a position that, frankly, most people 2 years ago thought was impossible to get to, right? When HR 1 became HR 1 in 2019, that wasn't just by happenstance. That was because we had built the momentum, we had built the support, we had shown the connection between voters' faith and trust and getting other issues done. But frankly, I think it took a lot of people by surprise. And the fact that so many of you continued to speak out on this, continued to work so hard, got us the Senate as well, and then kept the pressure on to make this be HR 1 and S1. By the way, only 4 times in the last 20 years has that happened, where HR 1 and S1 are the same bill. All 4 times it's become law. So we have precedents, we have history on our side, and we are not giving up till we get this done. So thank you so much. Please use the portal, call your representatives, attend town halls, ask the questions, write those letters to the editor, and don't hesitate to let us know how we can help. So thank you for being the just amazing grassroots army that we need to make sure we get this done.
Thank you. Okay, Elizabeth, you get to wrap us up.
I'm going to start by just saying this is not rhetoric. And I think for the first time in a long time, we have 791 pages of stuff that is really doing stuff for America. And even to Makisha's question, I didn't get to quickly think about this. The bill actually has a private right of action, where if there are things that are not happening that you need to happen, you can call somebody and say, call the Attorney General to go look into that, right? We are serious about this. Mr. Sarbanes has put together a package that actually delivers for the American people. And I think that's a big picture thing. My small picture thing is there are groups like yours that are already in coalition. Tiffany knows very well, ECU is a leader in this group called the DFAD. Melissa, I'm happy to share information about it. There are all these grassroots like you guys that are getting together and making that actual change happen. Literally, it's letters to the editor, it's lifting up the messaging as Mr. Sarbanes talked about. It's calling your senators and your House folks, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, say, have you heard about this? I want you to go in a town hall about it. I'm organizing one. You need to come speak about it, right? You create the pressure. And that's, again, so happy to talk to you guys about the content of it, but also the strategy behind it as well. Finally, I just want us to absorb truly that not since the Civil Rights Movement have we had an opportunity to bring this many Americans into the fold. And you have the opportunity to drive that change, that for all the things that we have felt have been broken and unfixable, somebody earlier said to me today, and it really stuck with me, our opposition is not our opposition. Our opposition is only cynicism.
Ooh,
And I
that's
thought
good.
incredible. She was so good. Yeah. She was from the Voter Rights Lab. I forgot her name, but
That's great. That's a good one.
that's all it is. And so when everybody has said this is impossible and people keep saying, well, break up the bill. If you break up the bill, it'll take 100 million years to get through Congress. Mr. Sarbanes did all the work to put it's all together package, right? You don't go to the restaurant and say, well, no, I'd like basil alone and then give me noodles later and you'll have some salt. Get the whole damn thing. So here's this opportunity to get all the rest of this done. And I just, both the existential piece of America, standing forward and saying we don't stand for discrimination, we stand for inclusion, and we actually stand for building. Together, it's just a pretty, like, existentially, it makes me proud of this country. It makes me proud to be in it. And I'm really grateful, not only for the work that Mr. Sarbanes and Tiffany and Melissa and Claudia and every single human on this call has done, but I'm proud of our optimism coming out of this moment. So I'm grateful to you for that. And thank you for bringing this over the finish line with us.
Good. Thank you. Oh my gosh. I don't think I can say anything more except thank you guys to the panelists. Thank you to Makisha, to Lisa, to Sophie, to Roxanne, Barbara and Claudia, all the people who helped us organize this. Let's get out there. Let's go do this. Join us at the portal. We will keep going. We might even have some follow-up. Thank you, everybody. Let's get this done. Have a good night. Take care.
Thanks, guys.